Sechas Yoma Daf Chav Vez begins the second parak of the Masechta, parak Barishona. The Mishnah, which opens the parak, begins by discussing which Kohen got the right to do the first avoda of the day, the avoda of Trumas Hadeshen, how he got awarded that job. There were two systems, the first system and the second system. The Gemara will discuss why they switched from system to system, how the systems worked precisely, and a couple of questions on why they switched. Then the Gemara will segue into a list of Agadata statements about Shaul HaMelech, who is referenced in the end of the discussion which precedes that. So the Mishnah begins, and it's talking about the avodah of Trumas Hadeshen. That was the first avodah of the day, in which Kohanim, at least one Kohen, would come and take a shovelful of ashes from the fire on top of the Mizbeach, which burned the Karbanos overnight, and he would take that shovelful and he would deposit it in a special place to the east of the ramp leading up to the Mizbeach, and it would be swallowed into the floor in that exact spot. Now, who would be the Kohen that got the right to do that? So the Mishnah says originally the system was that it was a race. Whichever Kohen wanted to do it would run up the ramp. Whoever got to within 4 amos, the Gemara will say 4 amos of where, but whoever arrived within 4 amos first won the race, and therefore he got the right to do the avodah of Trumas Hadeshen. The Gemara says that if there was a tie, then nobody won, and they would revert to the system of lottery. Now, at some point, they canceled the race because one Kohen pushed another at the top and he fell off and broke his leg. So they realized it was becoming a dangerous situation, and they canceled that. And then they just went to the lottery system for everybody. Now, how did the lottery work? The Kohanim who wanted to do the avodah would stand in a circle, and they each had the right to put out 1 or 2 fingers, and the Mamuna, the one who was in charge, would choose one of them to be the starting point by taking off his hat, and he would start counting from him. He would choose a random number, he would call it out, and then they would count the number of fingers sticking to the circle, going around and around the circle until they used up the numbers and it landed on the one who won. Now, you could stick out 1 finger or 2, and therefore you never knew where the number would end because you didn't know how many fingers would be. However, you couldn't stick out a thumb. And the reason is because some Kohanim, when they saw close to the end of the count that the number was just missing them, they would stick out a thumb. So that the next time around it would reach them, because by sticking out a thumb they would push the count back a little bit and they would be able to have it land on them. Now the reason that they would stick out a thumb is because the thumb is far enough away from their other fingers that they could stick it into the circle and the person who's counting wouldn't notice that it was an additional 3rd finger. Therefore they said no thumbs. If there's no thumbs, then he would say, hey, that's a thumb, somebody's cheating here. Now, this system of drawing lots was one of 4 lot drawing events that they had during the day to help choose which Kohen was going to get the right to do particular avodas. Now the Gemara begins, and the Gemara says, why didn't they just do the lottery straight away? Why did they first have the system of the race? So the Gemara says the reason is because they didn't think that there would be any problem having a lot of people wanting to do this avodah. This was not considered to be a chashuv avodah. It was considered to be not so important. And the Kohanim, they figured that there would be not much interest in it, and therefore they didn't think they needed a lottery. They said, listen, everybody run, and whoever, they didn't think there would be too many people. So the Gemara says, why did they think that it wouldn't be a particularly popular avodah? So the Gemara offers a couple of possibilities to this. So the Gemara first says, it's because it was a night avodah. The avodas during the day are the popular ones that Kohanim would vie for, but this was a night one, so they figured it's less important. But then they saw that the Kohanim were competing for it. So the Gemara says, well, if the fact that it's a night avodah makes it less popular, and therefore they didn't want to have the lottery system, so then the avodah of placing the Avarim and Pedarim, the limbs and the fats, onto the Mizbeach, that could be performed all night as well, so that should also be considered less popular. That's also a night avodah, and yet that they drew lots for, so obviously it wasn't a less popular, a less desirous, less coveted avodah. So Gemara says, well, that was different. That was at night, but that was the last avodah that was following the day, and therefore was part of the day that preceded it. So Gemara says, well, this was part of the day that is coming up. It was the first avodah of the day. It's also part of the day avodah. It's part of the coming day. So Gemara says, how do you know it's part of the coming day? So Gemara says, well, we know because of Yochanan said halacha that if somebody washed his hands, he came into the Azar and he washed his hands, he did Kiddush Yadayim before he did Trumas Hadeshen. So that washing of hands counts towards the rest of the avodah he's going to do that day. He doesn't have to wash his hands again afterwards. That means that this is considered to be part of the day. Right? Generally, the nighttime cancels your washing. So if this was still considered to be night, then he would have to wash his hands again. But The fact that washing your hands for the Trumas Hadesha counts so that your hands are considered washed for the whole day that follows means that it's already part of the day avoda. So Gemara says no. It's not that he washed his hands for the Trumas Hadesha. He washed his hands before the Trumas Hadesha. If he washed his hands for Trumas Hadesha, that wouldn't count for anything else. But he washed his hands before Trumas Hadesha for the rest of the day. That's what it means. It doesn't mean that he washed his hands for the Trumas Hadesha. It's really called a night avoda, not a day avoda. Okay, now there's a slightly different version of this. That the Gemara says that they thought that not too many Kohanim would want to do the Trumas Hadesha because it's hard to get up. They were asleep. They have to get up in the morning, and they have to wipe the sleep from their eyes in order to be able to get to do it, and therefore they thought it wouldn't be too many people competing for it. So the Gemara says, but again, the question, what about the placing of the Evarim and Pedarim on the fire? That's also an avoda that you need to wipe the sleep from your eyes, because it's late at night, and therefore everybody would be falling asleep. It's a lot easier to stay up late than it is to wake up early, as we can see today. So therefore it wasn't so hard. They figured that it would be popular to do the Evarim and Pedarim on the fire, and therefore they needed to institute right away that they had a lottery for that, rather than for people to wake up early in the morning. An early morning avoda would be less popular, and they thought they could just make a race for it. So now the Gemara asks, are you sure that the reason that they had a lottery was because it became a tzakana? It doesn't seem to be correct. It seems to be that the reason they made the lottery is because they wanted the person who did the Trumas Hadesha to do two following avodas as well. That is the avodah of organizing the wood in the fire and adding two large logs to the fire. Those were the avodas which immediately followed the Trumas Hadesha, and the Kohen who did the Trumas Hadesha got the right to do those two as well. That's why it became an important lottery, and they had to that's why it became a coveted, important avoda, and they had to draw lots for it. It's not because it became a dangerous thing and people were fighting over it. So Gemara says that there was really two steps in what happened over here. First, they had the race, and they thought that it wouldn't be popular, and therefore the race would work. Then it became a sakana. The guy fell off, and they said, you know what, we're going to make the lottery. But then once they made the lottery system, people stopped coming altogether because they said, why should I get up early and go run and go try to do the avoda of the Trumas Hadesha if I may not win it anyway? Now, it was popular enough for people to go, but it wasn't popular enough for people to get up if it was just a chance that they may get a chance to do it, and it was not for sure. For a suffix Trumas Hadesha that didn't get people out of bed, and therefore it became very unpopular. So they decided that what they would do was they would add on the avoda of organizing the wood in the fire and adding a log, and now people would get up for the opportunity to be part of the lottery that they could do the Trumas Hadesha plus the organizing of the wood and the adding of the log, and that's why those two steps were added, and that was part of the lottery as well. Okay, now the Gemara discusses which four amos were the finish line. So the Gemara first quotes Rav Papa, and he says, look, the 4 amos of the floor closest to the ramp, that's not what it means. It doesn't mean the 4 amos closest to the ramp on the floor. That it can't be, because it says that they ran up the ramp. It also can't mean the 4 amos, the bottom 4 amos of the ramp, because it says, first of all, that they ran up the ramp, and then whoever got to within 4 amos. So obviously, first they ran, and then the 4 amos is higher. It can't mean 4 amos somewhere in the middle of the ramp, because there's no mark. How are you going to know who won? So it's got to mean 4 amos on the top of the ramp. My question is as follows. The ramp of the Mizbeach ended 2 amos short of the ramp. Now, the ramp continued itself all the way to the roof of the Mizbeach itself, but the way the Mizbeach was constructed was somewhat like a wedding cake, that the top was 1 amma shorter than the middle, and the middle was 1 amma shorter than the bottom. It was built in concentric circles, kind of. And you had the yesod, which stuck out in amma at the bottom, and then the lower layer stuck out in amma from the top. So the ramp itself, when it came to the roof of the Mizbeach, the last 2 amas were not really ramped. They were really passing over the bottom 2 layers of the Mizbeach. So the question is, when it was within 4 amas, is it within 4 amas of the roof of the Mizbeach, when you actually stepped onto the Mizbeach itself, or is it within 4 amas of what would be the bottom layer of the Mizbeach, which therefore added 6 amas to the roof of the Mizbeach itself? That's a question that I have. I don't know what it means when it says 4 amas, and the Gemara says Teiku will find out whether it was within 4 amas of the roof or 6 amas of the roof. When Eliyahu Navi will come, then we'll figure out the answer to that. Okay, now how did the draw the exact lot. So, as we had seen, they each stuck out a finger and they counted the fingers. So the Gemara says, why don't they just count them themselves by their heads? Why do they have to stick out fingers? The Gemara says that Rabbi Yitzchak says that it's usher to count Jews by their heads, by them themselves, even if it's a mitzvah situation. And therefore, this must be the explanation as to here why you're not allowed to count them themselves. You have to only count the fingers. Now, how does Rabbi Yitzchak know you're not allowed to count Yidden? So the Gemara says, like the pasuk says in Sefer Shmuel, that when Shaul HaMelech went to war against Amalek, so he wanted to count them, and instead of counting them by themselves, they each put a broken pottery shard in a pile, and then they counted the pottery shards, as the pasuk says, Vayifkedem babezek, they counted them by the shards. So the Gemara says, how do you know the Vayifkedem babezek means they counted them by the shards? Maybe it means they counted them in Bezek, which is the name of a city, like a pasuk says, Vayimtzu Adoni Bezek, they found the ruler of Bezek. So maybe that's what it means. They counted them by their heads, but it was in the place called Bezek. So Gemara says that there's a different source of the fact that you're not supposed to count them, and that is after the war, Shaul wanted to count them, and it says he gathered the people together, and he counted them by the sheep, meaning each one took a sheep, and then they counted the number of sheep. So the Gemara says that's the source. It's from the fact that they counted by the sheep, and that's clearly that they counted sheep. There's no other way of interpreting that. So the Gemara says further, Rabbi Elazar says anybody who counts Yisrael violates a lav, like the pasuk says, the number of Jews will be like the sand on the sea, lo yimad, which is not measurable. Nachman Yitzchak says he's even over in a second lav. It's two lav, and it says lo yimad velo yisafer, which can't be measured and can't be counted. So again, he's violating two. So then the Gemara says that this is a theory here. Hold on a second. It says there'll be a number of Jews, like the sand in the sea. And then it says shelo yimad velo yisafer, which can't be counted. So which is it? There is a number, or there isn't a number. So the Gemara says, well, possibly that it depends on how Klal Yisrael are behaving. If they are doing Ritzon Shemakom and they are doing Hashem's will, then they are not countable. And if they are not, then they are countable. Rebbe says a different explanation. One means that there is a number that Shemayim is aware of, that heaven is aware of, but that people cannot possibly ascertain. Now, the Gemara says, I got it based on this, Rav Nehilai, Vayidi says in the name of Shmuel, when a person becomes a leader of Klal Yisrael, he becomes rich, in order that he be respected and followed. How do you see that? Because Shaul originally counted them by pottery shards, and then later he counted them by sheep. So look, his worth, his value went up from shards to sheep. So Gemara says, how do you know that he gave them sheep to count? Maybe he told them each bring your own sheep. So Gemara says, if that's what he did, so then why would it be significant? Who cares? Why do we care what he told them to bring? Obviously, it's coming to teach that he was able to give them now sheep instead of shards to show that he went up in his net worth, having become a leader. Now the Gemara launches into a lengthy Agadata about Shaul and a bit about David HaMelech as well. So first of all, the Gemara discusses Shaul's battle against Amalek. It says that he fought Amalek in the valley, Vayirav Benachal, in the valley, the gorge, the stream valley. So Gemara says this is where he began to have questions about his mission to destroy Amalek. It was about the valley that he was walking through reminded him, the Yitzhar came to him and reminded him of Eglah Rufa, which takes place over a stream. HaKadosh Baruch Hu had said you should kill Amalek, you should kill the men, women, children, and the animals. So Gemara says that he was bothered. Eglah Rufa, you have to save even one life. You have to go to such extent to save one life. So why should we destroy the people of Amalek? What did they all do already? The children, what did they do? The animals, what did they do? And he started having rachmanas on them. He started having mercy. So it says it was a bas kol that went out and said, listen, alti tzadik harbe, a pasuk in Koheles, don't be more righteous than you should be. Now, the Gemara now notes that it was a different time when he commanded Doeg to go and destroy Nover Kahanim, an entire city of Kohanim, and then the bas kol came out and said, don't be a Rasha. The next pasuk in Koheles, don't be too much of a Rasha. So don't be too much of a tzaddik, don't have rachmanis on the people who don't deserve rachmanis, and don't be too much of a Rasha, don't be wicked about people that do deserve rachmanis. Now the Gemara continues and it says how grateful a person must be, how spared he is from sickness and from worry if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is helping him. Because look at the difference between Shaul and David. Shaul did one Aveira and he was punished for it. David did two and nothing happened to him. What's Shaul's one? So it was the story with Agag, the fact that he spared Agag, the king of Amalek. That was a tremendous affair. Because of that, he lost his malchus, he lost his right to be king. So Gemara says that's his only avera. What about the fact he destroyed Nov Ir HaKohanim? So Gemara says, yeah, that was another avera, but that's not why he lost the malchus. We see from the fact that Shmuel Hanavi said, based on the avera of sparing Agag, that Hashem said, Nichamdi kim lachti es Shaul, I regret that I made Shaul king. You see, that avera itself was enough to cause Shaul to lose his malchus. And therefore it was for that one avera that he lost it. And that was just one. That was enough. For one avera itself, he lost his entire right. Now, what happened to David? So he did two averas. Someone says, what are they? So one was Uriah. He sent Uriah Achiti to the front lines in order that he should be killed. And he did that because he held that Uriah was a Merid b'Malchus. He was a rebel, and therefore needed to be removed. And the Gemara in other Masechtas agrees with him, and it doesn't find fault with him for that. But that was one thing he did. And the other thing was that he counted Klal Yisrael. He counted them, and that caused a tremendous plague to happen. So Gemara says those are only two averos. You said he did two averos, and he didn't receive a punishment for them. Those are the only two. What about the fact that he was together with Bas Sheva, the wife of Uriah Achiti? So Gemara says that he was punished for. That he definitely received. You can't say that that's one of the two that he wasn't punished for. He was punished for that. As you see, the Navi explains that a Nevuah came to Nasan Hanavi, and Nasan came to David afterwards, and he told him a story about a rich man who stole the stole the sheep of a poor man, and he took advantage of it. And David heard the story, and he said that man has to pay 4 times what he stole, and he should be killed himself. And Nasan said to him, this is all a mashal for what you did. You sent Uri to the front lines, and you stole his wife. So what David had said he needs to pay 4 times, that is something that David himself ended up having to pay. And he had 4 losses as a result of what he did with Bathsheba. What were the 4 things that he lost? First of all, Bathsheba became pregnant from him and had a child, but that child died. That was loss number 1. The other one was his son Amnon, who was killed by Avshalom. The next one was Tamar, the sister of Amnon, who was raped by Amnon. And the third is Avshalom, who rebelled against David himself and was killed by his general, even though he told him not to. So now the Gemara says, so you're telling me that we can't count Bathsheba because he was punished for that, but there was also punishment that he received for counting Klal Yisrael, and you said that was one of the 2 averos that he did that he was not punished for. What punishment did he get? Because it was a plague that happened. 70,000 Jews were killed in a Magefa because of that. So Gemara says that was a punishment, but it wasn't a punishment that affected him directly. It did not affect him in the body himself. We're talking about things that affected him personally. So Gemara says, so Bathsheba, he was affected by directly. Where was he affected directly? By what happened to, by the avera that he did to Bathsheba, that you're saying for that he was punished. He lost children, but he didn't suffer in his body. Gemara says he did, because he also got tzaras, and for 6 months he had tzaras, and the Sanhedrin wouldn't speak to him. As we see Psukim describing that, and after that was over, David said, Yeshuvuli Yireyecha v'yodeid v'yisecha. You, Hashem, those who fear you and those who know your Torah will return to me after my tzaras is over. And it says, Ashivuli Sisayin Yeshacha, also the Shechina departed from him during that time, and that returned to him afterwards as well. Now, the Gemara says, okay, I hear all that, but there's another avera that David HaMelech did. How could you say there's only those 2? Here's another one, and that's the incident with Mephibosheth. What happened? When David was chased out of town, when Avshalom rebelled against him, he asked Siva, who was the servant of Mephibosheth, who was a descendant of Yonasan, who was a friend of David's. He was a descendant of Shaul himself. So he asked Siva, where's Mephibosheth? Why is he not coming to help me? And Siva spoke Lashon Hara against Mephibosheth, and he said, he's against you. He's siding with the enemy. He's siding with Avshalom. And as a punishment for that, David said, I'm taking all his property away from him, and I'm giving it to you, to Tziva. Now, Tziva was the Eved of Mephibosheth, and he gave all of the property, which included Tziva himself, to Tziva. So he accepted that Lashon Hara. So that was an Avera. He wasn't supposed to accept Lashon Hara from him. So the Gemara elsewhere explains that it could be that he actually had proof that Mephibosheth was against him, but here the Gemara just says that he's accepting Lashon Hara, and that was an Avera. Mephibosheth, in truth, was not against him. He had actually put himself into mourning, and the reason why he didn't come to help David was because Tziva himself had tricked him into thinking that he didn't need help, he didn't want help. But anyway, there's the Avera of accepting Lashon Hara from Tziva. So the Gemara says that's not going to be on the list of Averas that he did that he didn't receive a punishment for, because he did receive a punishment for that. The punishment is as follows. When David finally met Mephibosheth, and Mephibosheth explained what had happened, David still did not fully accept it, and he said instead of giving all the property of Mephibosheth to Tziva, he's going to split it. Half will go to Mephibosheth, and half will go to Tziva. And in that moment, a voice came out of Shemayim and said, if you're doing that, then your property will be split as well. Half of your kingdom will go to your son Rechavam, while half will go away to Yeravam. Therefore, you're going to lose half your kingship. And again, that's the punishment that he received, and that's why it's not on the list. Okay, the Gemara now moves on to a few Agadatas about Shaul HaMelech. So, the Pasuk says, Ben Shana Shaul B'Malchai. Shaul was 1 year old when he became king. The Gemara says he wasn't literally 1 year old when he became king. He was as a 1 year old. Ki Ben Shana, like a 1 year old. Just like a 1 year old never did an Avera in his life, Shaul, at his advanced age, also never did an Avera in his life. So the Gemara says, how do you know that that's what it means he was like a 1 year old who never did an Avera? Maybe it means he was like a 1 year old that was filthy, rolling in the dirt and in the feces. So Gemara says that was suggested by Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, and that was a chutzpah, that was not correct, and therefore Rav Nachman in his dream was shown a malach chavala, a punishing angel, and he realized that he spoke disrespectfully. So therefore he apologized. He said, "Nanesi lechem atzmos Shaul ben Kish." I apologize to the bones of Shaul ben Kish. So what it is that he still, again, he saw the same punishing angel in his dream, and then he realized that he still didn't speak properly, and he said, "I apologize to the bones of Shaul ben Kish, Melech Yisrael, King of Israel," and that is when his apology was accepted. Now the Gemara says, why is it that Shaul, his kingship didn't last very long? He was king for 2 years, and there was no children of his who were king after him. It went from him to David. However, the kingship of David, that lasted forever. The Gemara says the reason is because the king has to have some problem in his history. He has to be humbled by some pagam, some flaw in his historical descent. And Shaul didn't have that. Shaul had a straight, clean history. The reason that the king has to have that is in order that he not be too much of a Baal Gaiva, so that the tzibur could say to him, listen, if you're going to start showing off, you're going to start talking down to people, we'll say, look at the bag of vermin hanging over your head, look at what's going on behind you. So David was descended from Rus HaMoaviyah, and there was what to criticize him for. But Shaul didn't have any, and therefore he did not have his kingship last too long. Otherwise, his children and his descendants would have been Bali Gaiva afterwards. Shaul actually had the opposite problem. The Gemara says the reason that he himself found himself in a situation in which he did the Avera of not listening to Hashem about Mechemes Amalek, the reason why he was put into that situation is because he was not firm enough. He did not stand up for the covenant of the kingship, and he let people make fun of him when he became king. There were those that didn't want to accept him, and they said, Ma yeshienu zeh vayivazu. They made fun of him. They said, this one's not going to help us. And he didn't stand up for the kingship, which is what he's obligated to do. A king is not allowed to give up on his proper kavod and respect. So that was why he lost the rights, and that was why he ended up ultimately losing the kingship, also for the same reason that the tzibur told him that they wanted to have rachmanas, they wanted to have mercy on the animals that they took from Amalek, and they wanted to keep them for themselves, and Shaul listened to them instead of standing up for what was correct.